In a prior video, we covered the 3-phrase bar form and 12-bar blues structure, and the 2-phrase period. In this video, we'll explore a key means of grouping 4 phrases into sections, and we call it the SRDC form. We'll then look at the various ways in which early Beatles songs begin with an introduction and end with a coda. The SRDC form is a 4-phrase unit. The acronym stands for Statement, Restatement, Departure, and Conclusion. It combines the notions of repetition, contrast, and return after a digression. It may be just like the 32-bar 4-phrase AABA form you may know from Tin Pan Alley repertoire, but it is usually a different sort of thing. We'll look at several different ways it can play out. Compared with the other structures we studied in an earlier video, the SRDC is not as common in the Beatles' cover repertoire, but it is heard in a number of their own original songs from 1962 and 63. One model for them is the Carole King song, Take Good Care of My Baby, as sung by Bobby Vee and performed by the Beatles for their 1962 Decca audition. We know that this was an important model for them as early songwriters, as the melody of its bridge forms the opening tune of She Loves You, a song that also incorporates harmony and melodic structure from Bobby Rydell's song Forget Him, written by Tony Hatch. In Take Good Care of My Baby, which will be outlined here, the first phrase, our S statement, comprises what we'll come to call the doo-wop progression in 4 bars ending on the 5 chord for a half cadence. This is then repeated for R, our restatement. The third 4-bar phrase departs from the familiar, functioning as the D gesture, and does so with a fragmentary 2-bar idea that's heard twice, the second time sequenced lower. And then a fourth 4-bar phrase introduces a new concluding tune for our C over the same doo-wop progression as heard in phrases 1 and 2. So we would label the 4 phrases with a design symbol A, B, and C, the last one based on the chords of A, but melodically very different. Note the ending of this 16-bar verse structure on an inconclusive half cadence. The second verse repeats the first, but answers this with an authentic cadence, forming a large 32-bar period of 2 SRDC units, the first verse functioning as a large-scale antecedent structure, and the second a big consequent structure due to the way that only the second verse ends conclusively. A second model is Till There Was You from the Broadway show The Music Man. Unlike Take Good Care of My Baby, this does represent the Tin Pan Alley 32-bar form, and this combines an initial verse of 2 phrases, a bridge, and a returning half of a verse, each of the 4 phrases 8 bars long. It works like this. The opening 8-bar phrase leads to a half cadence. The phrase ends like this. This phrase is then repeated, but finds its way the second time to an authentic cadence. And so we have an antecedent consequent pair, the tonic chord of bar 16 answering the dominant harmony of bar 8. It's a satisfying completion of the structure. The 8 bars that follow are the contrasting bridge, and like the bridges we studied in the earlier video, this one begins on the 4 chord, and that 4 chord is softened even more than usual by changing from being a major sonority, the diatonic form of the 4 chord, to a minor sonority by lowering this scale degree. And then the bridge proceeds through a raised 4th scale degree proceeds to the dominant, that raised fourth scale degree pushing up from 4 through sharp 4, the raised 4, to the fifth scale degree for the dominant. And then we press forward through an augmented dominant chord to raise the stakes, just as we heard in From Me to You. And my guess is the Beatles probably got the idea for the augmented dominant at the end of the bridge in From Me to You from this statement in Till There Was You. The bridge of Till There Was You is followed by the fourth phrase, which is identical to the second A prime phrase. And so we go from the bridge to just half of the first verse, skipping the antecedent, proceeding directly to the consequent phrase for an 8-bar verse. Altogether, SRDC form with 8 bars in each phrase, constituting a period, a bridge, and a truncated verse, for an overall design symbol of A prime, B, A prime. All sections work together to create a large-scale scheme of repetition, contrast, and abbreviated return. None of the song's later verses repeats the full 2-phrase structure of the initial verse. The original antecedent is lost for all time, giving the listener a good unconscious reason to want to hear the song once again. Something like this is going on in Anna. There's a large-scale SRDC, but it comprises 2 verses, a bridge, and a third verse. All are joined together because of the tie in the lyrics of the third verse to earlier words. The line, "Just one more thing, girl," and the conclusion of the story with the singer asking for his ring back wrap things up tidily into a single large-scale form. So the SRDC can be a large-scale form involving multiple song sections, but for the Beatles, it's more often like the basis of just the single verse of Take Good Care of My Baby. A second cover with this design is Burt Bacharach's Baby It's You. See if you can discover the statement, restatement, departure, conclusion pattern, and how many bars each phrase constitutes. It's not a simple 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. In this case, the C gesture, which invokes stop time, is the song's refrain. The Beatles released 7 of their own songs through 1963 that include verses formed as SRDC units, all concluding with a refrain that does not represent a return to earlier material. Let's look at the earliest example, Please Please Me. The first phrase of 4 bars ends with a half cadence marked by those Carl Perkins chords. And the second phrase, the R gesture, as the restatement, repeats the first phrase, but to a different ending on tonic harmony. Then in Please Please Me, the 4-bar departure gesture, John's impertinent "come on," repeated in rising lines that I hear based on the corresponding D gesture in Bobby Darin's 1959 hit Dream Lover. That D gesture in that verse goes like this. The same rising line, the same rhythm in the backing vocals, and the same 4 chord as the goal of that gesture all come back in Please Please Me. Everything in Please Please Me concludes nicely with an authentic cadence in the 4-bar refrain for an A prime, B, C pattern similar to that in the Darin song. Note that Lennon borrows just an interior phrase from Darin, never noticed by anyone, and that's the way the Beatles worked, taking small snippets, just as McCartney stole the melody for bars 5 and 6 of the verse of Little Child from bars 5 and 6 of the verse from Elton Hayes' 1952 song, Whistle My Love. No one would have known about that had Paul McCartney not busted himself. The other SRDC structures in early Beatle verses with refrains can be found in There's a Place, One After 909, I'll Get You, Not a Second Time, and Hold Me Tight. The verse of She Loves You is a very unusual SRDC with a pattern of A, B, B prime, ending with a half cadence. The two 16-bar verses, followed by an 8-bar chorus, make for a large-scale verse-verse-chorus bar form, with the first authentic cadence in this deliciously tense masterpiece held back for 40 bars. See if you can determine how the SRDC structure works in the other songs I've mentioned and what their design symbols would be. One After 909 and Hold Me Tight may be the easiest of these with which to begin. So for the Beatles, the SRDC would typically play out in a verse-refrain combination, although, as seen in their cover songs, it can also work at a larger level, combining verses and an intercontrasting section. Now to some ancillary and sometimes fragmentary formal sections that occur in most songs, but with a surprising variety of approaches, the introduction and the coda. There are many ways to begin a song. The Beatles might simply plunge into the first verse, as they do in Not a Second Time, but that's very rare. Usually, something is tacked on to the beginning. It might be a single chord, as with the dissonant jazz chord that opens All I've Got to Do. All I've Got to Do opens with a very unstable sonority. It's based on an augmented triad, which is itself very dissonant. And to that chord, Lennon adds two pitches that are not even part of the triad. And so altogether, we're left with a very dissonant opening sonority. Or the group might vamp over a tonic chord to set the stage for what's to follow, as in Chains, Don't Bother Me, or in I Saw Her Standing There, or its stepson, Little Child, both of which juxtapose the one chord with its lowered seventh, as does Chuck Berry in many numbers. Instead of just playing a major triad, Chuck Berry will often add the lowered sevenths to that chord. And so John Lennon vamps on that chord quite a bit. In I Saw Her Standing There, he plays it with this voicing. Something more dramatic might be the ticket, as in ending the intro on a tension-filled 5 chord, as in Twist and Shout, or I Want to Hold Your Hand. Boys opens with bars 9 through 12 of a blues, and the introduction to Money is a blues chorus that omits bars 5 through 8. Thank You Girl may be heard as bars 9 and 10 of a blues repeated, although the rest of the song does not refer to the blues model at all. The introduction may be a phrase that is never heard again, as when P.S. I Love You opens with the same progression the Beatles had created for the opening of the rejected A-side, How Do You Do It, which I'll need a guitar to demonstrate. So the Beatles were instructed to prepare How Do You Do It for their first single. It opens like this. Da 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 ba da. And it's those last 3 chords, very unusual combination, with which P.S. I Love You opens. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Much more often, the Beatles employ some craft, as first taught them by George Martin, in extracting some part of the song's interior and adapting it to serve as an intro. Martin knew the marketing value of a song's introduction. It had to spike curiosity immediately, and it was most effective if it contained a kernel of what was to follow. Ask Me Why, for instance, opens with the tag ending of the first verse. The Beatles begin Please Please Me with the guitar tattoo that punctuates the ending of every verse. The opening chords of the verse or chorus might expand tonic by juxtaposing it with a neighboring chord, and these could be repeated for an introduction, as when one moves repeatedly to 4 in Love Me Do and There's a Place. Now I need to explain how a 4 chord can be a neighbor to a 1 chord. So take Love Me Do, the introduction of which is based on its chorus, alternating 1 and 4. So let's say you've got the introduction to Love Me Do. That essentially is going to alternate between 1 chord and the 4 chord, just as the chorus does. Now, the roots are not next to each other. There's nothing neighborly about them at all. The roots of the 1 and 4 chord are actually pretty far apart, but they support neighboring motions in upper voices. So if you have a 1 chord, 2 members of that 1 chord will move to their upper neighbors. And so the 1 chord can move to the 4 chord and back in supporting those upper neighbors. Now the group's favorite such idea is to alternate the 1 chord with a neighboring 6 chord. And the way that works is 1 member of the tonic harmony, that pitch, will move to its upper neighbor, and those pitches will be supported by the 6th scale degree in the bass. And it sounds like the root of a 6 chord. And so the 1 chord can alternate with a 6 chord. A very common experience in the early Beatles, and very effective as it alternates a tranquil major with a moodily disturbed minor sonority, right? The major tonic with the minor 6 chord. Learned from covers, this alternation of 1 and 6 sets up the heartbreaking Anna, the desperately hopeful Please Mr. Postman, and the introspective Baby It's You and You've Really Got a Hold on Me. The Beatles recreate the idea in their own From Me to You and It Won't Be Long, each introduction connected to a different guitar tattoo. As learned from A Taste of Honey, the intro could be a tempo-free performance of the song's refrain, recreated in Misery, or simply an operatic slow phrase not heard again, like the dark, tempo-free minor mode opening to the brisk major mode, Do You Want to Know a Secret? More sophisticated are the openings of She Loves You and the later Can't Buy Me Love and Help for their rearrangements of chorus material. See if you can hear the different ways that the introductions to Till There Was You, Devil in Her Heart, and This Boy relate to the songs that follow. With the coda, a song could end one of 2 ways. It could stop cold, as would happen on stage, or it could fade out on a repeated outro, which could only be accomplished in the studio. A number of songs have an outro that fades out in studio recordings, but are given a cold ending for live performance, such is true of Love Me Do, There's a Place, and This Boy. The studio fade-out outro actually transforms Do You Want to Know a Secret, which the Beatles had probably wanted to end on a tonic chord with added 6th, a sound we know that George Martin did not like, but which they would later insist be used at the end of She Loves You over his objection. We can guess this preference because the Beatles end with this chord in live performances of Do You Want to Know a Secret? This is how it ends on stage. It's compositionally effective because it's a satisfying concluding tonic in an authentic cadence, but it adds the 6th scale degree to that final tonic chord. There's that 6th scale degree, and that had functioned as the root of the 6th chord in the song proper, thus tying together 2 different harmonic areas with suggestions of both the major and the minor sonorities with one sound. In She Loves You, the final added sixth chord, done here, is produced when Paul and John both sing members of the one chord. Paul sings this pitch, John sings this pitch, but George adds this, the added sixth, which sums up the song's drama between minor triad despair and major triad hope. We get them together with the final chord of the song. The Beatles also end Chains on an added sixth chord for the BBC, but fade out on record. Of the Beatles' first 5 singles, only the first A side, Love Me Do, and the last B side, This Boy, end with fade-outs, which we call outros. All 8 other original songs on these singles end cold, probably as the group would expect to be performing them in concert. Of the 9 tracks on the first 2 albums that fade out, 7 are original compositions, and few of those would be performed live. The most notable aspect of the repetitious fading outro is the opportunity for vocal improvisation, put to advantage by Paul in Love Me Do and Little Child, by George in Do You Want to Know a Secret and Don't Bother Me, by Ringo in Boys, and by John in every other case, showing off his falsetto in Misery. An effective way to add to a song's energy level is to ramp up the final chorus into a rowdy raver mode. That's what the Beatles do in Matchbox, Money, Roll Over Beethoven, and especially in Long Tall Sally with its Some Fun Tonight section. These songs all end with Ringo getting everything he can out of his ride cymbal. Similar is the repeated Wait a Minute section that ends Please Mr. Postman. The Beatles follow Little Richard's version of Kansas City by adding 2 unrelated sections, one entitled Hey, 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 and a second which might be called Bye, 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 Bye. These numbers always generated a lot of excitement in the seats, but we note that Pete Best did not enter raver mode for the last chorus of The Saints, a truly lost opportunity. Of the cold ending codas, 2 techniques are worth looking at: the one more time cadence and the reharmonized fragment. The first is a vaudevillian throwback to stage hams. In fact, the Beatles' 1961 cover of the 1920s number Ain't She Sweet is the first time we hear the Beatles practice a one more time ending by repeating the song's last line, a simple conclusion heard again in the old song September in the Rain. Often, such a refrain is heard 3 times, as in the outdated numbers somehow part of this act that was to change rock music forever. Besame Mucho amplifies the faux drama with a halftime ending, cutting the tempo of the last line by 2, just as the Beatles did for the big finish in I Got a Woman. The triple ending of the Beatles' first such composition, I Saw Her Standing There, may suggest it has roots in such chestnut material. But this ending is also characteristic of the closer-to-home rockabilly songs I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry by Elvis, who was never above hamming it up, and Glad All Over by Carl Perkins. One After 909 can be singled out for its particularly camp vaudevillian ending. Said we're traveling on the one after 9-0. Said we're traveling on the one after 9-0. Said we're traveling on the one after 909. The repeated fragments that end Please Please Me are interwoven by overlapping vocals from John and Paul in a way that almost predicts the opening of Paperback Writer. The Beatles will return to such fragmentation, but with a new twist possibly learned from the ending of Frank Ifield's I Remember You, which restates the repeated fragment, Tell them I remember, tell them I remember, tell them I remember you, over changing chords identified here that portray the same idea from multiple perspectives. kaleidoscopically recolored repetition of fragments graces the highly original endings of From Me to You, Bad to Me, She Loves You, and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and is later key to such songs as Yes It Is, Help, and I Will. Although it doesn't qualify through repetition, John's It Won't Be Long falls into the vaudeville category with the tempo-free, purple spotlighted, How Dry I Am barbershop chords that close off the final refrain. Other codas are quite simple, returning to introductory material but with allowances for fine drum fills from Ringo in Thank You Girl. Hold Me Tight brings back the non-diatonic chord that had opened the bridge, alternating it with tonic for two final hearings of that odd sonority. In Twist and Shout, the song gets its first authentic cadence at the very end, when a one chord is finally achieved by ramping up to it in triplets, the same rhythmic device that finally brings us home in I Want to Hold Your Hand. We will devote one later video to very small-scale formal devices important in pre-1964 Beatles, the tattoo, the motto, and the riff, but also the pre-chorus and extensions and abbreviations of forms. In the meantime, pay close attention to how Beatles songs begin and end. These were among the final decisions made in the composing and recording processes, always the product of great care, as they embodied the first and last impressions the records would make.